What would you do if the person you trusted most planned a secret getaway with someone else? In this gripping story of betrayal and revenge, a devoted husband uncovers shocking truths about his wife's double life. As secrets unravel and emotions ignite, the question lingers: how far would you go for justice? The rain pattered against the windshield as Alden Marsh sat motionless in his parked car. The dim glow of streetlights illuminated the cafe in front of him, where his wife Nadine sat laughing with another man. Her hair, tousled slightly from the damp air, framed her face perfectly as she leaned closer to her companion. Alden's heart clenched as he watched. There was nothing outwardly inappropriate, just two colleagues enjoying coffee perhaps, but something in her body language, the way her fingers brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, spoke volumes. He checked his phone for the 100th time, scrolling through Nadine's calendar. Client meeting, it read, nothing unusual. Yet the scarf he had found in her car earlier that morning, a man's scarf, sat heavy in his mind. Alden sighed, his breath fogging up the window. He wanted to be wrong, desperately. At home that morning, the day had begun as every other day did. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled their kitchen as Nadine busied herself preparing Owen's lunch. Their 16-year-old son sat at the counter groaning about an upcoming math quiz. Alden watched them from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, marveling at how ordinary yet perfect it all seemed. "Have you seen my gray scarf?" Nadine's voice was casual, her back to him. "No," Alden lied, his stomach twisting. He had seen it, in the back seat of her car, crumpled beneath an unfamiliar men's cologne. Now, sitting in the car, Alden's thoughts spiraled. He tried to convince himself there was an innocent explanation. Nadine had always been fiercely loyal, or at least he thought so. For 20 years, they had weathered every storm together, job losses, moves, even the struggle to have Owen. They had emerged stronger, or had they? A soft chime broke the silence. A message flashed across Alden's screen. It was Nadine. "Running late, don't wait up for me tonight." His fingers trembled as he stared at the text. It wasn't the first late night she'd had recently. Work had suddenly become her escape, and her reasons always felt too polished, too rehearsed. Alden couldn't shake the image of her smile as she looked across the table in the cafe. That man, who was he? He started his car, the hum of the engine drowning out the rain. He couldn't sit here any longer. He had to go home. But even home felt different now, quieter, heavier. Walking into the empty house, Alden hung his coat by the door. Nadine's shoes, neatly lined up, were a stark contrast to his chaotic thoughts. On the kitchen counter, a half-eaten apple and a notebook lay abandoned. He picked up the notebook and opened it absent-mindedly. His eyes scanned the page, lists of groceries, reminders for appointments, until something caught his attention. "Weekend plans, Asheville." The words stared back at him, sharp and unrelenting. Weekend plans? Nadine hadn't mentioned any. She hadn't mentioned Asheville either. Alden's chest tightened as his mind began piecing things together. Was it a work trip? Was it— No, he wouldn't let himself go there. Owen's voice startled him. "Dad, where's Mom?" Alden turned to his son, forcing a smile. "She's working late, bud. Let's order pizza, yeah?" Owen shrugged and disappeared upstairs, leaving Alden alone with his thoughts. He stared at the notebook again, the words blurring in his vision. Something was wrong. He felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't just a client dinner or a business meeting. Nadine was hiding something, and for the first time in their marriage, Alden didn't trust her. He closed the notebook, the pages snapping shut like the end of a chapter. This wasn't over. Whatever was happening, Alden would find out. The house was still, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound that broke the silence. Alden sat at the dining table, his hands clutching his phone. The notebook with Nadine's mysterious "Weekend Plans Asheville" sat open in front of him like an accusation. Questions churned in his mind, but answers seemed elusive. He stared at Nadine's empty chair, the space she normally occupied during their family dinners. It felt like a void, one that grew larger with each passing day. He scrolled through his messages, his thumb hovering over Nadine's name. Should he call her? Ask her outright? But what would he say? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft vibration, the sound of Nadine's phone. It was sitting on the counter, forgotten in her rush out the door. Alden hesitated, his heart racing. This wasn't like him. They trusted each other. They always had. But something inside him, a gnawing feeling he couldn't shake, compelled him to pick up the phone. His fingers moved almost of their own accord as he unlocked it. The passcode was still the same. Owen's birthday. Alden swallowed hard as he opened her messages. The screen glowed, and there it was. A name he didn't recognize. Reed Chapman. The thread was short, with only a handful of exchanges. But the most recent message made his stomach drop. "Can't wait for this weekend. I'll make it unforgettable." The words felt like a slap. His breath caught and he blinked, hoping the message would somehow change. But it didn't. It sat there, mocking him, each word sharper than the last. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, but there wasn't much else, just brief cryptic notes. Still, the implications were enough to twist the knife deeper. Alden leaned back in his chair, the phone slipping from his grasp. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe Reed was just a colleague. Maybe the message meant something entirely different. But the words, "I'll make it unforgettable," echoed in his head, refusing to let go. The front door creaked open, and Nadine's voice floated through the house. "I'm home," she called. Alden jolted upright, shoving her phone back onto the counter. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he tried to compose himself. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more. "Hey," Nadine said, stepping into the kitchen. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How was your evening?" Alden forced a smile, the weight of the message pressing down on him. "Uneventful. Owen's upstairs studying." His voice sounded strange, even to him. Nadine didn't seem to notice. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. His chest tightened as he watched her. Did she know he'd seen the message? Was she hiding something, or was he imagining it all? "I've got a big meeting tomorrow," Nadine said casually. "Might be a late night." Alden nodded, his mind already spinning. Another late night. Another excuse. "You okay?" Nadine's voice cut through his thoughts. Her eyes searched his face, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah," Alden said quickly, forcing a laugh. "Just tired, that's all." She smiled faintly, but the moment lingered, heavy with unspoken tension. When she finally left the room, Alden let out a shaky breath. He looked down at the notebook again, the words, "Weekend Plans Asheville," glaring back at him. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together. And it terrified him. That night, Alden lay awake in bed. The glow of Nadine's phone still burned into his mind. The way she had smiled at him earlier, as if everything was normal, it felt like a lie. He turned over, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and fear. What was she hiding? And more importantly, why? Alden woke up to the sound of Nadine bustling around the bedroom. The clock read 6 a.m., but her energy seemed unusually high for so early in the morning. She was humming, a soft, cheerful tune he didn't recognize. It struck him as odd. He watched her from the bed, feigning sleep, his mind replaying the message from Reed Chapman over and over. Nadine moved with purpose, pulling clothes from her wardrobe and carefully laying them into a suitcase. The sight hit Alden like a punch to the gut. She hadn't mentioned any travel plans, but here she was, packing. He shifted slightly, the mattress creaking under his weight. Nadine paused, her eyes darting toward him before returning to her task. She didn't speak, didn't explain. Alden lay still, his thoughts racing. He needed answers, but confronting her now would only push her further into secrecy. Instead, he waited until she left the room. Moments later, the sound of the shower running told him she was occupied. It was the window he needed. Rising quietly, Alden moved to her suitcase. Inside, he found outfits he didn't recognize, sleek dresses, high heels, and a small velvet jewelry box. His hand hovered over it for a moment before flipping it open. A pair of diamond earrings gleamed back at him, their brilliance feeling like mockery. The suitcase wasn't all. Tucked beneath the clothing was a printed itinerary, the name Blue Ridge Retreat Spa bolded at the top. His stomach sank as he read the details. A weekend reservation for 2. The name next to Nadine's wasn't his, it was Reed Chapman's. The shower shut off abruptly, jolting Alden back to reality. He shoved everything back into place, his hands trembling. As he sat back on the bed, feigning nonchalance, Nadine emerged, towel-wrapped and radiant. "You're up early," she said, her tone casual. Alden forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep. You?" "Big weekend ahead," she said lightly, avoiding his gaze as she busied herself drying her hair. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, his silence heavy with unspoken tension. Nadine continued as though nothing was amiss, her cheerfulness grating against Alden's growing resentment. Later that morning, after Nadine had left for work, Alden sat at the dining table, his laptop open. The information he'd gathered so far, messages, receipts, and now the itinerary, formed a damning picture. Yet it still felt incomplete. He needed to know more. He searched Reed Chapman online. A dozen results appeared. Articles about his success in real estate, photos from charity events, and interviews painting him as a charming, successful businessman. But something about his smile in those photos felt calculated, too polished. Then he found it. A small mention in a local news archive, allegations of insider trading tied to a failed property deal. The article was brief, the charges ultimately dropped, but it was enough to ignite Alden's suspicion. Who was this man Nadine seemed so captivated by, and why did she trust him? By noon, Alden had devised a plan. He called Lila Weston, his trusted confidant, and shared everything he had discovered. "This isn't just an affair, Lila," Alden said, his voice tight with anger. "There's something deeper here. He's dangerous." Lila's voice was steady, but her concern was clear. "Alden, you need to be careful. Don't let this consume you." "It's too late for that," Alden replied. "He's taken her from me. I can't just stand by." Lila sighed. "Gather everything you can. Evidence, witnesses. You can't act on emotions alone." Her words lingered long after their call ended. That evening, Alden sat alone in his office, sifting through emails, bank statements, and more. Each piece of information felt like another brick in the wall separating him from the life he thought he had. When Nadine came home that night, she was tired but cheerful, her demeanor a stark contrast to Alden's growing darkness. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, her touch brief, almost dismissive. "Long day?" Alden asked, masking his sarcasm. "Exhausting," she replied, stifling a yawn. "I'm heading to bed early. Big weekend ahead." She disappeared upstairs, leaving Alden in the quiet of the house. The walls seemed to close in around him as he stared at her retreating figure. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the way she carried it so effortlessly, as though it meant nothing. Alden clenched his fists. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more. But as the pieces of her web of lies fell into place, one thing became clear. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Alden sat at the corner table of a quiet coffee shop, his fingers drumming on the edge of his mug. The unease from the night before still clung to him like a shadow. Across from him, Lila Weston, his oldest and most trusted friend, was carefully studying his face. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, didn't miss a thing. "So," Lila began, breaking the silence, "what's going on? You sounded different on the phone." Alden hesitated. Saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat, but he knew he couldn't face this alone. He took a deep breath and began. "It's Nadine," he said, his voice low. I think she's cheating on me." Lila didn't react immediately. She simply leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Tell me everything," she said softly. He laid it all out. The late nights, the cryptic messages, the trip to Asheville, and the name Reed Chapman. As he spoke, his voice wavered between anger and despair, the betrayal cutting deeper with every word. When he finished, Lila exhaled slowly. "Reed Chapman?" she murmured, her tone laced with recognition. "I know that name." Alden's head snapped up. "You do?" Lila nodded, her expression darkening. "He's a piece of work, Alden. I've met him a few times. Social events, fundraisers. He's charming, sure, but there's something off about him. He's not who he pretends to be." "What do you mean?" Alden pressed, his pulse quickening. "There were rumors," Lila explained, her voice steady. "Deals that went sideways, people who trusted him and got burned. Nothing that ever stuck legally, but his reputation isn't clean." Alden's grip tightened on his mug. So you're saying he's dangerous? I'm saying you need to be careful, Lila replied firmly. If Nadine's involved with him, there's a lot more at stake than your marriage. The words hit Alden like a freight train. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This man, this stranger, wasn't just taking Nadine from him, he was dragging her into something darker. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. Finally, Lila reached across the table, her hand resting on Alden's. What are you going to do? I don't know, Alden admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't just sit back and watch this happen. You can't act impulsively, Lila warned. If you want to confront her, or him, you need to have everything lined up. Evidence, a plan. Don't let anger cloud your judgment. Alden nodded, though his thoughts were anything but clear. His heart was screaming for action, but his mind, fueled by Lila's calm logic, knew she was right. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they left the coffee shop, Lila pulled him into a brief hug. You're not alone in this, she said quietly. Remember that. Driving home, Alden replayed their conversation in his head. Lila's words echoed with a clarity that both comforted and unsettled him. He had trusted Nadine with everything, his love, his life, his son, and now that trust was unraveling thread by thread. That evening, as Nadine breezed through the front door with a casual, "Hey, hun," Alden felt the knot in his chest tighten. She moved through the house effortlessly, her actions so routine it was almost cruel. "Busy day?" he asked, his voice measured. "Non-stop," she replied, her tone light. "Meetings, calls, you know the drill." Alden nodded, his expression neutral, but inside, his resolve hardened. He wouldn't let this continue, not without a fight. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of control, a spark of determination. As Nadine disappeared upstairs, Alden pulled out his phone and began typing. It wasn't much, just a search. Reed Chapman Asheville. The results filled the screen, and as he scrolled, a plan began to take shape. Alden's mind raced as he sifted through the results of his search on Reed Chapman. Articles painted him as a rising star in the real estate world, handsome, successful, and ambitious, but beneath the glowing headlines were whispers of controversy, failed projects, shady partnerships, and unresolved lawsuits. The man wasn't just a philanderer, he was a risk, and now Nadine was entangled with him. As the pieces began to align, Alden felt a new sense of purpose. He couldn't confront Nadine yet, not until he knew exactly what he was up against. That meant he needed more than gut feelings. He needed proof. The notebook with Weekend Plans Asheville wasn't enough. The itinerary for the Blue Ridge Retreat Spa wasn't enough. He needed something definitive, something undeniable. The next morning, Alden made a call to a private investigator. "Discretion is key," he said, his voice low as he paced the kitchen. "I need everything you can find on Reed Chapman, and anything you can uncover about my wife's movements." The investigator agreed to take the case, and Alden hung up, feeling both relief and unease. He had never imagined his marriage would come to this, a tangle of lies and surveillance. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for sentiment now. Later that afternoon, as Nadine returned from work, Alden forced a casual tone. "You're back early," he noted, watching her carefully as she hung her coat. "Yeah," she replied, brushing off his comment. "I have to pack tonight. Early start tomorrow." "For your retreat?" Alden asked, his words calculated. Nadine nodded, her eyes meeting his for only a second before darting away. "Just a few days. Lots of meetings, networking. You know how these things go." He didn't respond, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Nadine cleared her throat and moved to the kitchen, her movements quick and deliberate. "Don't wait up for me tonight," she added over her shoulder. "I'll probably be up late getting everything ready." Alden's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Of course." That night, after Nadine had gone to bed, Alden slipped out to her car. He installed a GPS tracker beneath the dashboard, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. It felt wrong, invasive even, but he reminded himself it was necessary. He needed to know where she was going, who she was meeting, and what she was hiding. The next morning, as Nadine's suitcase rolled down the driveway, Alden stood by the window watching her leave. Her smile was easy, her wave casual, as though she weren't shattering the foundation of their life together. The sight filled him with equal parts sorrow and resolve. He waited until she was out of sight before grabbing his phone. The GPS tracker's signal blinked to life, showing her heading west, toward Asheville as expected. But something about seeing it on the screen made the betrayal feel even more tangible. She wasn't just lying to him, she was acting on it. Alden spent the rest of the day preparing. He mapped out the spa's location, noting nearby hotels and restaurants. He booked a room under a false name, ensuring he'd be close enough to observe without being seen. He packed a small bag, his movements mechanical, his mind numb. By the time the sun set, Alden was in his car, following the same route Nadine had taken hours earlier. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through dense forests and past quiet towns. Each mile brought him closer to the truth, and further from the life he thought he knew. The Blue Ridge Retreat Spa loomed ahead as Alden pulled into a secluded parking lot on the edge of the resort's grounds. The sprawling complex was tucked into the mountainside, its grand facade glowing under the soft light of dusk. Alden turned off his engine and sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his eyes scanned the building. Every fiber of his being wanted to rush inside, to demand answers, to end the charade, but he forced himself to remain calm. Patience, he reminded himself. This wasn't the time for reckless emotion. He reached for his phone and opened the GPS app. Nadine's tracker pinged her location inside the main building. Alden's stomach twisted. She was here. She had really come. The confirmation, though expected, hit him with the force of a freight train. Taking a deep breath, Alden stepped out of his car. The cool evening air bit at his skin as he adjusted his jacket and walked toward the entrance. The reception area was warm and inviting, its polished wooden floors and cozy decor exuding an air of tranquility. A young woman at the desk smiled as he approached. "Welcome to Blue Ridge Retreat," she said cheerfully. "Do you have a reservation?" Alden hesitated, his mind racing. "Actually, I'm meeting someone," he replied, keeping his tone casual. "Reed Chapman. He mentioned he'd be here for the weekend." The receptionist's smile didn't waver. "Oh, yes. Mr. Chapman and his guest checked in earlier today. They're enjoying dinner in the private dining area." Alden's chest tightened, but he forced a polite nod. "Thank you," he said, turning away before she could ask any more questions. He made his way to the lounge, careful to stay out of sight as he surveyed the room. The soft murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses filled the air. In the far corner, through a partially open doorway, Alden caught sight of Nadine. She was seated at an intimate table with Reed, her laughter ringing out like a dagger to his heart. She leaned forward, her hand lightly brushing Reed's arm as she spoke. Alden clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. The scene was surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. This couldn't be his wife. This couldn't be the woman he had built a life with, shared dreams with. But there she was, her actions undeniable. He retreated to a quiet corner, his breathing shallow as he tried to regain control. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from the private investigator. "Found something you'll want to see. Reed Chapman's real estate history is a mess. Call me when you can." Alden's jaw tightened. He couldn't handle this alone, not anymore. He needed more information, more leverage. But for now, he needed proof. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned his attention back to Nadine and Reed. From his vantage point, he pulled out his phone and discreetly snapped a photo. The image was blurry but clear enough to show Nadine and Reed together. It wasn't definitive proof of an affair, but it was enough to validate his suspicions, and enough to make his blood boil. As the dinner continued, Alden noticed something else. Reed's demeanor wasn't just charming, it was calculating. The way he spoke, the way he commanded Nadine's attention, it felt orchestrated, and Nadine, for all her confidence, seemed nervous. She glanced around the room occasionally, her smile faltering for brief moments before returning. Alden's stomach churned. This wasn't just an affair. There was something more, something darker. He didn't know what it was yet, but he intended to find out. As the night wore on, Alden slipped out of the resort unnoticed. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal. But beneath it all was a growing determination. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The dining room was buzzing with quiet conversation and the soft clink of glasses, a perfect picture of luxury and tranquility. But Alden's world was anything but tranquil. His heart pounded as he stepped into the room, his eyes locked on the table in the corner. Nadine sat across from Reed, her laughter ringing out like a taunt, her hand lingering on the edge of her wine glass. Alden's footsteps were steady, his breath measured, but his resolve burned like fire. As he approached, Reed caught sight of him first, his expression shifting from relaxed charm to wary surprise. Nadine noticed the change and turned her head, her smile freezing as her gaze met Alden's. For a moment, the entire room seemed to fall silent. Alden stopped just short of their table, his hands at his sides, his posture rigid. "So this is the big retreat," Alden said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to slice through the tension. His eyes flicked between Nadine and Reed. "Not exactly what you told me, Nadine." Nadine's face paled, her hand instinctively moving to her chest. "Alden, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Alden interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. He turned to Reed, his jaw tightening. "And you must be Reed Chapman. I've heard so much about you." Reed recovered quickly, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Mr. Marsh, I presume? It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Funny," Alden replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I can't say the same." Nadine rose from her seat, her movements jerky. "Alden, please, not here. Let's talk somewhere private." "Private?" Alden repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Like the private retreat you've been planning? Or the private messages you've been sending to him?" He gestured toward Reed, his hand trembling with restrained anger. "Why don't we talk about that?" Reed stood now, his calm demeanor barely masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Look, Alden, this is between you and Nadine. I don't think—" "No, you don't," Alden snapped, cutting him off. "If you did, you'd know better than to mess with another man's wife." The dining room had gone completely silent, every eye in the room fixed on the scene unfolding. Nadine's voice cracked as she tried to regain control. "Alden, stop! You're making a scene." "A scene?" Alden said, his voice shaking with incredulity. "No, Nadine. A scene is what you made when you decided that this—" he gestured at the table at the untouched wine and candlelight— "was worth throwing away 20 years of marriage." Nadine's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but her words sounded hollow even to herself. "Then tell me," Alden challenged, stepping closer. "What is it, Nadine? Help me understand how the woman I've loved for 20 years, the mother of my son, ends up here, with him." She couldn't answer. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her hands clutching the back of her chair for support. Reed, sensing the growing volatility, raised his hands in mock surrender. "Alden, maybe we should all calm down." "Calm down?" Alden's voice was dangerously quiet now. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my family, to my life?" Reed opened his mouth to respond, but Alden didn't give him the chance. "Stay away from her, from us," Alden said, his words a growl. "You think you've won something here? You haven't. All you've done is ruin everything you've touched." He turned back to Nadine, his voice breaking slightly as he added, "And you let him." The weight of his words hung in the air as he turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy but unwavering. Behind him, the murmurs of the other diners began to rise again, their whispers filling the space where his voice had been. Outside, the cold night air hit Alden like a slap, but it did little to numb the pain coursing through him. He leaned against the hood of his car, his breath visible in the chilly glow of the parking lot lights. The confrontation hadn't brought the closure he craved. It had only confirmed the depth of Nadine's betrayal. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. For the first time in weeks, he felt hollow, as though the fight had been drained from him. And yet, as he stood there alone, one thought remained clear in his mind. This wasn't over. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and unforgiving. By the time Nadine returned home from Asheville, the carefully constructed facade of her life had already begun to crack. Alden had stayed quiet, retreating into his thoughts, but the storm he had set in motion was far from over. 2 days after the confrontation, an email made its way to Nadine's office. It wasn't from Alden, but its contents were unmistakable. Attached were photos of Nadine and Reed at the Blue Ridge Retreat Spa. Candid, intimate, undeniable. The email was anonymous, but the damage was immediate. Whispers spread like wildfire among her colleagues. Meetings grew colder. Smiles became fewer. The very people who had once admired Nadine's professionalism now avoided her gaze. At lunch, her closest work friend Julia slid into the seat across from her face tight with concern. "Nadine," Julia began hesitantly, "I don't know how to say this, but people are talking." Nadine's stomach dropped. "Talking about what?" she asked, her voice too sharp, too defensive. Julia leaned in, lowering her voice. "There are photos. Someone emailed them to half the office, you and someone else, at a resort." Nadine felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table. "That's ridiculous," she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. Julia hesitated, then placed a hand on hers. "Look, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but it's not good, Nadine. People are starting to question your judgment, even management." Nadine pulled her hand away, her cheeks burning with a mix of humiliation and anger. "Thanks for the warning," she said curtly, rising from the table. She didn't look back as she walked out of the cafeteria, her heels clicking loudly against the tiled floor. Back in her office, Nadine closed the door and sank into her chair. She opened her laptop, her fingers trembling as she searched her inbox. The email wasn't there. Whoever had sent it hadn't included her. But the photos were everywhere now, forwarded and whispered about, each click of the mouse eroding her carefully built reputation. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Reed. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but she couldn't. She needed answers. "What's happening?" she demanded as soon as she answered. "Did you send those photos?" Reed's laugh was cold and humorless. "Why would I do that? It's probably your husband. He looked like he was ready to burn the place down." Nadine's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny? My career is on the line, Reed." "Your career?" Reed's voice hardened. "You think this hasn't affected me? I have investors asking questions, Nadine. This mess isn't just yours." The line went dead, and Nadine stared at her phone, her chest heaving. The betrayal she felt toward Alden was eclipsed only by her growing resentment toward Reed. She had gambled everything for him, her marriage, her family, her reputation, and now she was paying the price. When she got home that evening, Alden was in the kitchen, silently washing dishes. He didn't look up as she entered, his movements deliberate and calm, but the air between them was heavy with tension. "Was it you?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. Alden didn't answer immediately. He placed the plate in the drying rack, wiped his hands on a towel, and turned to face her. "Was it me who exposed your lies?" he said, his tone even. "Or was it you, Nadine, when you decided they were worth telling?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Alden stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You destroyed this family the moment you chose him. I just gave the world a glimpse of what that looks like." Tears filled Nadine's eyes, but Alden didn't wait for a response. He walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the quiet kitchen, the weight of her choices crashing down around her. The office light above Reed Chapman's desk flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow over the piles of documents strewn across his workspace. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the polished wood. His phone buzzed, pulling his attention away from the mess before him. He smirked as he saw Nadine's name flash across the screen. "Nadine," he answered smoothly, leaning forward. "What's wrong now?" "Don't act like you don't know," she hissed, her voice laced with panic. "The photos, Reed. They've ruined everything." Reed chuckled, the sound cold and detached. "Calm down, darling. Those photos were just a bump in the road. Nothing we can't handle." "A bump?" Nadine's voice cracked, her frustration palpable. "My career is falling apart, Reed. People at work won't even look me in the eye. And Alden, he's made sure I have nowhere left to hide." Reed's smirk faded slightly as he turned his chair to face the window. The city lights sparkled below, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in his life. "Nadine, you're being dramatic. Things will settle down. They always do." Nadine's silence was deafening. Reed sighed, his tone softening. Look, this isn't the end, it's just a setback. You're stronger than this. You don't get it, she snapped. I gave up everything for you, my family, my reputation, and now, what do I have left? Reed's jaw tightened. You still have me, he said curtly. Isn't that enough? The line went dead and Reed stared at his phone, irritation simmering beneath his calm exterior. Nadine was becoming a liability, a loose thread in his carefully woven tapestry. He had gambled on her loyalty, but now her panic threatened to unravel everything. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Lucas, his longtime assistant, clutching a folder that seemed to weigh heavily in his hands. Sir, Lucas began hesitantly, you need to see this. Reed took the folder, flipping it open with a practiced air of disinterest. But as his eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkened. Bank statements, emails, and contracts, proof of his misdeeds, meticulously compiled. Where did you get this? Reed demanded, his voice dangerously low. Lucas hesitated. It was sent anonymously. There's more. Rumors are spreading among the investors. They're starting to ask questions. Reed slammed the folder shut, his mind racing. The photos, the whispers, the sudden scrutiny. It wasn't a coincidence. Alden Marsh was behind this. The realization hit like a lightning bolt. Alden wasn't just a scorned husband, he was a man with a plan. And now Reed's empire, built on charm and deception, was under siege. As the hours ticked by, Reed's frustration turned to fury. He paced his office, formulating a strategy. If Alden wanted to play games, Reed was ready. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. Dominic, he said when the line connected. I need your help. Discreetly. The voice on the other end chuckled. It's been a while, Chapman. What's the problem? Just a small issue, Reed replied, his voice smooth as silk. There's someone poking around where they shouldn't be. I need it handled. As he ended the call, Reed felt a flicker of satisfaction. He wasn't the kind of man to be outmaneuvered, not by someone like Alden Marsh. This was his world, his game, and he wasn't about to lose. But as he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the folder on his desk was a stark reminder that his grip on power was slipping. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Alden wasn't backing down, and Nadine's unraveling loyalty only made things worse. Reed's smirk returned, sharper and colder than before. If Alden wanted a fight, he would get one. But Reed Chapman didn't fight fair. The slam of the front door echoed through the house, jarring Alden out of his thoughts. He looked up from the dining table where he had been staring blankly at his cold cup of coffee. Owen stood in the doorway, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "Why's Mom not home yet?" Owen demanded, his voice sharp. Alden hesitated. He had been dreading this conversation, but the storm between him and Nadine had spilled over into their son's life. There was no escaping it now. "She's staying somewhere else for a while," Alden said carefully, his words measured. "We've been going through some things." Owen's brow furrowed, his frustration giving way to suspicion. "Going through what? Why can't she just come home? What's going on, Dad?" Alden opened his mouth but couldn't find the right words. How could he explain this to his 16-year-old son? The betrayal, the lies, it was too much. "It's complicated, Owen," he finally said, his voice soft. "But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Owen dropped his backpack to the floor with a thud. "Then whose fault is it?" he shot back, his voice cracking. "Because it sure feels like it's yours." The accusation stung more than Alden expected. "I know you're upset," he said, trying to stay calm, "but you need to understand, your mom made some choices that—" "Choices?" Owen interrupted, his eyes blazing. "What does that even mean? Why don't you just tell me the truth?" The room fell silent. Alden's hands tightened into fists under the table. He wanted to protect Owen, to shield him from the worst of it, but he knew his son wasn't a child anymore. "Your mom has been seeing someone else," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "That's why she's not here." Owen's face twisted in shock and disbelief. "What? No, that doesn't make any sense. She wouldn't do that." Alden's chest ached as he watched his son wrestle with the truth. "I wish it weren't true," he said, "but it is." Owen took a step back, his hands running through his hair as if trying to make sense of it all. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Do we just stop being a family?" "No," Alden said firmly, standing up. "We are still a family. It's just going to look different for a while." "Different?" Owen scoffed, shaking his head. "It's not a family without Mom." Alden stepped closer, placing a hand on Owen's shoulder, but his son shrugged it off. "I know this is hard," Alden said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's hard for me too, but we'll get through this. Together." Owen didn't respond. He grabbed his backpack and stormed up the stairs, his door slamming shut moments later. Alden sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. He had already lost Nadine, and now it felt like he was losing Owen too. That evening the house was eerily quiet. Alden sat alone in the living room, staring at the photos on the mantelpiece. One in particular caught his eye. A family vacation to the Grand Canyon years ago. They had been so happy then, so full of life and love. He picked up the frame, his thumb brushing over the glass. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made him look up. Owen appeared, his face pale and tear-streaked. He hesitated in the doorway before speaking. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose both of you." "You won't," Alden said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "I promise you, Owen, we're going to get through this." Owen nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he sank onto the couch beside his father. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, the weight of their shared grief heavy in the air. But as Alden placed an arm around his son, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that even in the darkest times, they still had each other. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against Alden's chest. He sat at the plaintiff's table, his fingers tightly clasped together to keep them from trembling. Across the room, Nadine avoided his gaze, her posture rigid as she sat beside her attorney. This wasn't how Alden had imagined they'd end up, strangers in a room full of legal jargon, fighting over what remained of their shared life. "Mr. Marsh," the judge's voice broke the stillness, pulling Alden's attention. "You're seeking full custody of your son and filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alden replied, his voice steady but low. Nadine's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we contend that Mr. Marsh's claims are not sufficient to deny my client joint custody. While mistakes may have been made in the marriage, Miss Marsh has been a devoted mother and deserves to remain equally involved in her son's life." Alden clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm as the attorney painted a sanitized version of events. Mistakes, as though years of betrayal could be boiled down to a single misstep. His own lawyer rose, presenting the evidence Alden had painstakingly collected, the photos of Nadine and Reed at the spa, the itinerary, the bank statements showing gifts purchased under Alden's name without his knowledge. Each piece was laid out methodically, each one slicing deeper into the illusion Nadine had tried to maintain. Nadine shifted in her seat, her face pale but defiant. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, her voice trembling. "I made mistakes," she began, her eyes darting toward Alden before quickly looking away. "But I have always been there for Owen. I've loved him, supported him, and I won't let one mistake erase everything I've done for him." "One mistake?" Alden's voice cut through the air before he could stop himself. The judge raised an eyebrow, and Alden's lawyer placed a hand on his arm, cautioning him to stay silent. Nadine's composure faltered, and for the first time, Alden saw a flicker of something real, fear, regret, or perhaps just exhaustion. "I'm not perfect," she continued, her voice breaking, "but Owen deserves to have both his parents." Alden's heart twisted. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she still cared for their son as much as she claimed. But the evidence told a different story. She had lied to him, to Owen, to everyone. How could he trust her now? The day dragged on, each argument cutting deeper into their already frayed connection. Witnesses were called, including Lila, who spoke to Alden's character and his dedication to Owen. Reed's name came up repeatedly, his absence in court conspicuous but damning nonetheless. When the judge finally adjourned, Alden felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. The decision wouldn't come immediately, but the battle lines had been drawn. As he left the courtroom, Owen's face flashed in his mind, his wide eyes, his trembling voice when he'd asked, "What happens to us now?" Nadine caught up to him in the hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Alden," she called softly. He stopped but didn't turn. "What do you want, Nadine?" he asked, his tone weary. She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't want it to end like this." Alden turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for any trace of the woman he had once loved. "It ended the moment you chose him," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "Now we deal with the fallout." Her expression crumbled, but Alden didn't wait to see her response. He walked away, the echoes of her footsteps fading behind him. That night Alden sat at home, the silence of the house both a comfort and a reminder of all that had been lost. Owen was upstairs, the sounds of his video game faint through the walls. Alden closed his eyes, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Whatever the court decided, he knew one thing for certain. This was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. Not for himself, but for Owen. For the future, they still had a chance to rebuild. The slam of Owen's door reverberated through the house, a sharp punctuation to yet another argument. Alden stood in the hallway, his fists clenched at his sides. He stared at the closed door, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had no idea how to reach his son anymore. Owen's struggles had grown worse since the court hearings began. His grades were slipping, once lively friendships had cooled, and his temper flared at the slightest provocation. The boy who used to laugh at Alden's bad jokes and beg for extra pancakes on Saturday mornings now felt like a stranger. Alden knocked softly on the door. "Owen," he called, his voice weary but gentle. "Can we talk?" "Go away," came the muffled reply. Alden sighed, pressing his forehead against the wood. "I know you're angry, and I know this is hard, but shutting me out won't make it any better." There was no response. Alden lingered for a moment longer before turning away, the ache in his chest growing heavier with each step. Downstairs, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of mail he had no energy to sort through. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Lila. "How's Owen holding up? Let me know if you want to talk." He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a quick reply. "Not great. I'll call later." That night, as Alden lay awake in bed, he heard the faint creak of Owen's door opening. He sat up, listening as his son's footsteps padded down the hallway. Alden hesitated before following, finding Owen in the kitchen, staring blankly at the open fridge. "Couldn't sleep either?" Alden asked softly. Owen jumped slightly but didn't look at him. "Just thirsty," he muttered, grabbing a bottle of water. Alden leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "You know, you can talk to me, Owen, about anything." Owen's grip on the bottle tightened. "You wouldn't get it." "Try me," Alden urged, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. Owen hesitated before finally meeting his father's gaze. "I feel like I don't matter," he admitted, his voice trembling. "Mom's busy with her, whatever, and you're so focused on this stupid court stuff, it's like I'm just in the way." Alden's heart broke at the words, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on Owen's shoulder. "You are not in the way," he said firmly. "You're the most important thing in my life. Everything I'm doing, it's for you." Owen shrugged off his hand, tears brimming in his eyes. "Then why does it feel like we're falling apart?" Alden took a deep breath, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Because we are," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean we can't put it back together. It's going to take time, and it's going to be hard. But I promise you, Owen, we'll get through this. Together." Owen looked at him for a long moment before nodding slightly, the tears finally spilling over. Alden pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as Owen sobbed against his chest. It was a small moment, a fragile truce in the chaos, but it was enough to give Alden hope. Later, as they sat together on the couch, Owen's head resting on his father's shoulder, Alden knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had taken a step forward. Nadine sat on the edge of the twin-sized bed in her modest apartment, staring at the empty walls. The room was cold, the beige paint peeling in places, and the faint hum of traffic outside only deepened the silence. The life she had built with Alden and Owen felt like a distant memory, one that she had foolishly traded away. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the stack of photographs she had found while packing. Each image was a time capsule, filled with laughter and love that seemed almost unrecognizable now. One photo in particular stopped her, a candid shot of Alden holding a giggling Owen on his shoulders during a family trip to the beach. The sunlight had caught them perfectly, their faces glowing with happiness. Nadine's chest tightened. She had taken that photo, never imagining it would one day haunt her. She reached for a pen and a blank sheet of paper. The words wouldn't come at first. Her mind was a swirl of guilt, anger, and loss. Finally, she began to write, "Alden, I don't even know where to begin. How do I apologize for everything I've done? How do I explain the choices that tore our family apart? You always deserved better than what I gave you, and Owen deserved a better mother. I thought I was chasing happiness, but all I found was emptiness. And now I see, I had everything I needed all along and I threw it away." Her tears smudged the ink, but she kept writing, the words spilling out like a confession. "I was selfish. I thought I was missing something in my life, but it wasn't something. It was me. I lost sight of who I was, and in the process, I lost the two people I love most. I don't expect forgiveness, Alden, but I need you to know that I regret every moment I hurt you. I regret breaking the family we built together." She paused, the weight of her admission settling heavily over her. The letter felt inadequate, too little, too late, but it was all she had. The next day, Nadine found herself parked outside Alden's house. She sat in her car for what felt like hours, staring at the home they had shared, watching the lights flicker on as the evening set in. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Owen, his face lit by the glow of a television. Alden appeared behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder as they exchanged a few words. The sight struck Nadine like a blow. They looked okay. They looked like they were moving on. Her heart ached as she clutched the letter in her hands. Part of her wanted to walk up to the door to beg for a second chance. But deep down she knew it was too late. Her choices had built a wall between her and the life she had abandoned, and no letter could tear it down. Instead, she slipped the envelope into the mailbox and drove away. The streetlights blurred as tears filled her eyes. She had hoped that writing the letter would bring her some sense of peace, but the emptiness remained. Regret had become her constant companion, a reminder of everything she had lost, and everything she would never get back. That night, Nadine lay in the dark, clutching the photograph of Alden and Owen. Her tears soaked the pillow as she whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry." But the words, like her actions, were swallowed by the emptiness. Alden stood in the doorway of his new home, a modest two-story house on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting playful shadows across the front porch. It wasn't as grand as the home he had shared with Nadine, but it felt lighter, freer, like a fresh page in a long, painful story. "Dad, where's this box go?" Owen called from the driveway, his arms straining as he carried a box labeled books. "In the study," Alden replied, stepping outside to help. He grabbed the box from Owen, who rolled his eyes but smiled faintly. "Careful, these are my treasures," Alden joked, and Owen snorted. The move had been a turning point for them. It was a chance to leave behind the shadows of their old life, the echoes of arguments and tears, and start something new. Alden had hesitated at first, wondering if uprooting Owen would do more harm than good, but the way his son had laughed during their first visit to the new neighborhood, a rare, genuine laugh, had erased any doubts. Inside, boxes were stacked high against the walls, their contents waiting to be unpacked. Alden surveyed the room, his mind already buzzing with plans. He would set up the living room with photos of their adventures, build a small garden in the backyard where Owen could shoot hoops, and turn the study into a space for work and reflection. Later that evening, as they sat on the floor eating pizza from paper plates, Owen glanced around the room. "It's different," he said. "Good different or bad different?" Alden asked, raising an eyebrow. Owen shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. "Good, I think. It's weird, though, like starting over." Alden nodded. "That's exactly what it is. A fresh start, for both of us." Owen didn't reply immediately, but after a moment he said quietly, "Do you think Mom's okay?" The question hung in the air, and Alden took a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I hope she is." Owen nodded again, his expression unreadable. "I miss her. Even though I'm mad, I still miss her." "I know," Alden said gently, "and it's okay to feel that way." They fell into a comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling around them like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, Alden felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of everything being perfect. It was the peace of knowing they were moving forward. The next morning, Alden woke early, the soft light of dawn streaming through the windows. He brewed a pot of coffee and stepped onto the back porch, the cool air invigorating. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about everything they had been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the endless nights of questioning his own worth. And yet, here he was. Here they were. Not whole, but healing. He heard the creak of the screen door and turned to see Owen, still groggy but smiling. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, Bud," Alden said, ruffling his son's hair as they sat side by side on the porch steps. They watched the world wake up together, the birds chirping in the trees, the faint sound of a lawnmower in the distance. "I think we're going to be okay," Owen said suddenly, his voice full of quiet conviction. Alden smiled, his heart swelling. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." As the sun rose higher, Alden felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And for the first time, he believed that was enough. Nadine stood on the opposite side of the street, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her coat against the cold breeze. The sight of Alden and Owen stepping out of their new home pierced her heart. They looked different, happier, lighter, as though the weight of her absence had been lifted rather than mourned. She hadn't intended to come here. Her car had seemingly driven itself, her regrets guiding her more than any map. Across the way, Owen laughed at something Alden said, his head tipping back in genuine amusement. Nadine's throat tightened. She hadn't seen that laugh in months, not since the cracks in their family became too wide to ignore. She wanted to call out to them, to cross the street and insert herself back into the picture. But she stayed rooted in place, her feet unwilling to move. The letter she had left in their mailbox weeks ago had gone unanswered. Not that she had expected anything else. It had been a plea for forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve, a feeble attempt to bridge a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Alden hadn't responded, and Owen was moving on. As Alden opened the car door for Owen, Nadine caught a glimpse of his face. There was strength in his expression, a quiet determination that was both unfamiliar and deeply painful to see. He was no longer the man she had left behind, burdened by doubt and sorrow. He had become someone new, someone resilient, and it broke her to realize she had no part in that transformation. A couple walked past Nadine, their chatter pulling her back to the present. She turned slightly, hoping they wouldn't notice the tears pooling in her eyes. But the momentary distraction only deepened her isolation. She was alone, truly, irreparably alone. Reed was gone, his promises of excitement and escape unraveling like a bad dream. The fallout from his schemes had left her reputation in shambles, her career reduced to whispers of poor judgment and unprofessional conduct. She had no one to blame but herself. The car engine roared to life as Alden and Owen pulled out of the driveway, their laughter still echoing in Nadine's ears. She watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing down the street like a final farewell. For a moment she thought about following them, about trying one last time to explain, to apologize. But what was left to say? Her actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. Nadine's hands slipped into her pockets, her fingers brushing against the crumpled edges of an old photograph. She pulled it out. A family portrait taken years ago, back when Owen was still small enough to sit on Alden's shoulders. She traced their faces with trembling fingers, her tears finally spilling over. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But there was no one to hear her, no one to offer absolution. The life she had destroyed was no longer hers to reclaim. Alden and Owen had built something new, something stronger without her. And she was left with nothing but memories and regret. As the cold wind picked up, Nadine turned and walked back to her car. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, its streets filled with strangers who neither knew nor cared about her pain. She slid into the driver's seat and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable, broken, hollow, a shadow of who she used to be. She sat there for a long time, the engine idling softly, before finally driving away. The road ahead was empty, much like the future she faced. And as the city lights faded behind her, Nadine realized that some mistakes could never be undone, some bridges never rebuilt. The end wasn't dramatic or redemptive, it was quiet, unyielding, and final.